Hi there. I'm Angelo John Lewis for the Sacred Inclusion Network. If you'd like to know more about us, please visit our website, sacredinclusion.com. In advance of our April 16th symposium on spirituality and social justice, I'm interviewing one of the esteemed panelists, Cat Zavis, who's the executive director of the Network of Spiritual Progressives. She wears a lot of hats. She's been a collaborative divorce attorney. I shouldn't say she is a mediator, and she's also coached parents for co-parenting their children after divorce. She's been a longtime activist in social change work. She's worked as a volunteer for the ACLU, prisoners' rights organizations, domestic violence victims, lawyers, Committee for Human Rights, and many others. And she grounds her life and work in the wisdom and spiritual traditions and bring those values to her work every day. And she's an ordained rabbi recently. Welcome, Rabbi Cat.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
You know, Cat, there's a long tradition of Jewish involvement, especially I think of the civil rights movement in my lifetime. And I'm wanting to introduce our audience to you. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your sort of background and how that grounded you in social justice work and, for that matter, spirituality.
Sure. So actually, my pull toward social justice work, I think is how I'll call it, is watching Roots as a young child. At 12 years old. This was before there was, as you well remember, before there were a zillion channels. There were like 3 different channels, and it was on every channel, I think. And everyone I knew was watching it. And I was sitting in the living room. I can still like bring myself back into that moment and be in that room with all the colors that were in the room and the whole experience. And I remember watching Kunta Kinte, who was the main character, being ripped from his mother's arms as he was being sold to another, as he was being trafficked as a child. And I completely lost it. I mean, I just started screaming and crying and yelling, and like my little body, my physical body could not handle it. And as well as none of our bodies should be able to handle watching something like that, frankly. And that, as I look back on my life, that was the moment, I think, when I said, I'm going to spend my life's energy ensuring that people are treated with kindness and love and dignity and respect. This is, what kind of world is this? This is not okay. And I don't know that at that age, in fact, I'm sure at that age, I didn't know how much slavery in modern manifestations still existed, how much oppression and racism still existed in my life at that time. But I came to learn that. And so that's, I would say that's really where I first had my awakening. Judaism is very much steeped in social values, but frankly, as a young child, I didn't know that so much, other than it's in my bones.
So you grew up in a secular Jewish household?
I grew up in a secular, I mean, we were Reform, but we were definitely secular. And but the values, I always talk about some of the values of Judaism certainly seeped into me deeply. Judaism is rich in intellectual engagement and challenge. As someone I was just reading wrote, ask good questions and challenge authority. Like, those are profound messages of Judaism. And as we come up to Passover, which is next week, I grew up going to Passovers. And somewhere in there, we were told about we were slaves and now we're free. And so the liberation theology and belief system grounded in Judaism was certainly something I'd always been exposed to. I was not exposed to it nearly as richly as I have been now in my very recent life in the last 12 years, which has been a blessing for me because it's brought together what Judaism offers that I did not know until I was exposed to this, is it combines under one theological faith spiritual tradition, and this is true of other traditions as well, I'm just speaking about my tradition. It offers a combination of, as I already mentioned, like rich intellectual challenge and engagement, psychological depth, and insight, deep spiritual, mystical wisdom and exploration, and then radical politics. I mean, if you read the Torah, it's really, it has very, as does everything, it has both voices. It has the voice of radical liberation and transformation. It has the voice of oppression and power over and domination. But if you listen to the voice of transformation and liberation, it's really a critique of oppression.
So, I know a lot of secular Jews, and they would not call themselves spiritual at all. I don't know what they would call themselves, but anyway, that's not a word that comes to mind for a lot of them. So I imagine there was a time in your life, and you just sort of alluded to it, but I'm wanting to go a little bit deeper and to find out when was it or what happened to get you in touch with the sort of spiritual aspect of Judaism.
So I would say I was always spiritual. I just would have never known that was the term I used. So when I did go to Sunday school, what Reformed schools or mine did was Sunday school, not Shabbat, but I did not on Saturday. Our Shabbat is on Saturday, but then we've adopted some of the Christian practices. So we had, kind of Sunday school on Sunday, and I was confirmed, not bat mitzvah. And in that process, excuse me, I warned you about my puppy. I'm just going to let him out.
Okay.
Okay, now you have to stay out. That you get when you have a 4-month-old puppy. The delight and challenge. So forgive me. So I remember asking the rabbi and teachers, whomever, questions about God, like theological, spiritual questions. And at that point, I didn't get any answers. I think that would be very different today, but that was in the 70s and there were no answers for me. So I had no incentive to stay in Judaism because it didn't really offer me answers to the questions I was asking. I was asking deep existential questions that, frankly, I think all kids ask. My kids asked them when they were kids. I don't think I was particularly unique in that. I just didn't get answers, so I turned away. And so I think I was searching throughout my life for connections with something more meaningful, something grander, something out beyond just myself. And so I found that a lot in nature and hiking and camping. I found that for a while I dabbled in Buddhism and meditation. And what I found in when I dabbled in that was I practiced in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition so that there was still some connection with my inclinations for social justice. And what I found was it didn't resonate with my Jewish soul, because part of my Jewish soul is wrestling and outrage and passion that for me, when I was in the Buddhist tradition, I found was being like contained in a way.
Inferior, right.
Yeah, it wasn't allowing me to express it. I'm not saying that's true for all Buddhist practice or anyone else, but that was just my experience, that my Jewish soul was like not able to kind of contain itself within that. Whereas meditation is still deeply meaningful to me, and I practice it. But in that instance, like I couldn't find a way to integrate it with kind of the suffering that I see in the world. And Abraham Joshua Heschel says, I'm going to misquote him, but the essence of what he says about the prophets is that they feel God's pain and they cry God's tears. That they, like, when they see one minute suffering, it's as if the whole world is shattering. And I think that my heart has that experience. When I see one person suffering, my heart shatters. It's just kind of like when I was watching Roots, it becomes unbearable to my soul. Truly, it just truly becomes unbearable to my soul. And just meditating about it, I needed to do something. I needed to find a path. And I was already doing social justice work. It wasn't that I wasn't, but I don't think you mentioned I was a public defender. before I did those other practices of law. And then I studied women's rights and did women's rights law. So there was lots of ways in which this has always been my path. But I came to Judaism by meeting Rabbi Michael Lerner and being exposed to a Judaism that, as I said, has under its umbrella all of these aspects, including this radical, what I call spiritual activism. And that's really now how I find myself landing in this integration of spiritualism and activism that's very meaningful and rich to me, that provides me a spiritual foundation that holds me and grounds me in a world that's so ungrounded and so tumultuous and difficult at times, and teachings that, people and communities have been grappling with these issues for thousands of years. Yeah,
you're a rabbi. Obviously, you studied these things. It's not like something that comes out of you of whole cloth. So when you talk about the tradition of Jewish activism, let's say Jewish spiritual activism, I wonder if maybe you can just sort of give me a sense from the history of Judaism as to how these two things come together, meaning spirituality and social justice.
Yeah. So I feel like I want to pull down my books and just kind of quote them, but I'll just do it from my mind. So there's a book called Pirkei Avot, The Ethics of the Fathers. And it's an entire ethical book. It's the beginning, it's incredible. And it has all of these values, essentially. It states all these values of how we should lead our lives. And that to me it's faith, and it's grounded in like how we build a world. The Torah says, so, when you've heard the statement, if not now, when? That's one of, if I'm not for myself, who's for me? If I'm not for others, who am I? If not now, when? That's from Pirkei Avot. There's a zillion things that you see quoted in memes all over the internet, and a lot of them arise from Pirkei Avot. Or, the Torah says more than any other offering, any other thing it teaches, love the stranger. You are strangers in the land of Egypt. 36 times it says that. And it says, why? Because I am your God who brought you out of slavery. And you remember what it was like to be enslaved. So right there, like love the stranger, because there's this force in the universe. So when I think of the term God in the Torah, which are the letters Yud, He, Vav, He, so that's where you get Yahweh, but we don't pronounce it. But I think of that force, and again, this is from the teachings of Rabbi Michael Lerner. I think of it, the way I translate that is that force in the universe. You can think of it as a spiritual force that makes possible the transformation from that which is to that which can and ought to be. So if you were to read the Torah, and every time you see those letters, every time you read the word Adonai, which is how it's usually translated, and instead of reading as Adonai, which means Lord, as that force in the universe that makes possible the transformation from that which is to that which can and ought to be, you would really see how radical the Torah is. And so it's spiritual and political because there is a liberating force in the universe. I don't think of it as this man in heaven, no. But there is this force in this universe. I think of it as love that calls us to engage in acts of love. And when we engage in acts of love, the only thing we can do is build a more just world. That's the only thing love calls us to do. So like one night I was walking before Shabbat, and our Shabbat goes from Friday night till Saturday night, basically sundown to an hour after sundown. And I was taking a walk, preparing myself, and it was just a beautiful evening. And I look up in the sky, and it's just this beautiful view of the moon and the sun setting and the star, the beginning of the stars and some planets. And all of a sudden I thought, oh, that's God. Like that's love. The force that's holding all the planets in their place so that I am alive in this moment. So you are alive in this moment. So Earth is functioning. So the universe works is love. The scientists call it gravity, but I call it love. And if we if we were to actually use that language,
Mm.
if we actually thought about that force being a force of love, that the arc of history bend towards justice, right? It requires our involvement.
Mm.
You know, Passover, the Exodus story of liberation. You know, if I believed in a man in heaven being able to transform things, God wouldn't have needed Moses. God wouldn't have needed Miriam. God wouldn't have needed the midwives who stood up to Pharaoh's order to kill all male-born Hebrew babies. God could have just waved his magic wand and boom, the Hebrews were free. But God requires the love in the universe, that force of transformation in the universe requires our participation. And that to me is how it's integrated. That there's this mystical spiritual energy and we're a part of it, and we're not all of it. All of us are a part of it, but it's so much more. And we can bring our hearts, our inclinations for love that all of us actually have within us to the effort, to the call for building a loving, caring, and just world.
Oh, that's really well said. So I'm thinking of the sort of like the I guess the thesis of our symposium and subsequent events is that there is this connection between spirituality and social justice, which you so eloquently explained. At the same time, I know that there are people that are involved in maybe one pole more than the others. And it's my sense, it's my belief that unless you have both, there's something that's missing. So I wonder if we can talk about that a little bit. So let's say that I'm a social activist. I don't think about any of the things that you just addressed. What are some dangers in that path?
I think that one of the challenges social justice activists face is that often we can be dismissive of and demeaning towards people who do believe in a faith tradition, who do practice religious faith traditions. And that to me is the greatest risk. I mean, I also think that activists need some way to nurture themselves in and ground themselves in something that's greater than themselves, because the effort to transform the world is slow and tedious and difficult. And as I was talking to somebody yesterday, it's like doing the bunny hop, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. It's a very long marathon and we need a deep well. And what I'm finding is that the younger generation is recognizing that, and a lot of them are turning back toward some type of spiritual center to support them on that journey. So that's one aspect. And then let me return to the first part I mentioned, which is that we can be very glib and dismissive of people who talk about God and talk about that they believe in God. And if we want to build a world based on love and justice, we have to find a way to open our tent and embrace people who have faith traditions that maybe are different than ours. And part of it is, let's be honest, a lot of the faith traditions have been extremely oppressive and abusive and violent. And so people turn away, understandably. And so there's lots of trauma there. And so we have to hold that with compassion and empathy and understanding. And at the same time, recognize that there are people who are deeply steeped in faith traditions that are very meaningful for them, that provide them a sense of comfort and safety. And how can we speak to them in a way that honors that and also calls them to the highest teachings and values of their tradition, rather than to the teachings in all traditions that teach hatred and oppression. So let me step out, if I may, for a moment and give a bigger picture here. So in all throughout history, in all faith traditions, I mentioned this briefly before, certainly in the Torah, in the Quran, in the Gospels, in all faith traditions, there are at least 2 voices. There's really more, but I'm going to simplify it. There's a voice of domination and power over. right? That's very prevalent in our society. That is the voice of capitalism. That's the voice of racism, sexism. It's in order for me to be secure and safe in this world and get ahead, I have to step on you, right? I have to climb the corporate ladder. I have to be better than. And kids learn this at a frighteningly young age. And we've all absorbed that. All of us have that voice in of us, every single one of us. We can't help it. And then there's the other voice, right? What I mentioned, kind of like the voice of God, if we will, the voice of love, the worldview of love and care and kindness and generosity. And we all come into the world actually with that. We all come into the world seeking love and connection, seeking being seen and held and cared for. And then depending on our parents, our schooling, just a zillion different, our religion, our milieu that we operate in, the voice of domination or the voice of love, the worldview of domination or the worldview of love, you'll be hearing them constantly. Which one's more prevalent depends on who you are and how you're raised and all the things you're exposed to. But if you listen to the radio or you listen to the news or read the news or whatever, you can ask yourself, are they speaking about a worldview of love or domination? And, right now it's almost always domination. You don't ever hear President Biden saying, maybe we should talk to China about the fact that we want to build a loving world where everyone's secure and safe. Well, it's never the question that's asked. A bomb goes off and we bomb them back. We don't ever ask, how can we transform this world to love? It's a lot cheaper and a lot safer for everyone. So this tension exists in all of us. And we build our social change movements, we build our businesses, we build our nonprofits, we build our government, we build our schools, informed by this. And depending on which worldview we're in, that's the structure we're going to build. And so the work of for me, one of the primary works of social justice work isn't only to fight for the struggles for greater pay, for enter racist policies. Those are manifestations of these worldviews. They're manifestations of a domination worldview. So one of the things that's radical about the Exodus story is that Moses wasn't simply sent to free the slaves. Moses was sent to overthrow the consciousness of oppression. That's why they were in the desert for 40 years. They didn't even get to go into the land because they never were able to free themselves from the domination, oppression consciousness. So for me, the work that I like to do, in addition to fighting those struggles, it's about also, we have to raise consciousness so that we can understand, are we operating from the domination worldview or the love worldview? And the path from like the worldview of domination to the worldview of love, from my perspective, is paved, P-A-V-E-D, paved with like stepping stones of what I call prophetic empathy. And so that's my work in this world. And what does prophetic empathy mean? That's going to be a much longer discussion, but that is how we move from domination to love. And if you ask people in social change movements, a lot of folks will say that they experience the environments that are unwelcoming, demeaning, you're not woke enough. And what happens? It pushes people away, right into the welcoming, loving arms of communities who love and embrace and accept them just as they are. And often those communities don't love and embrace and accept everyone else, right? They do it at the cost of collective love. We don't have to do that. We could have collective love, and we have to be willing to accept people where they are at, because all of us are perfectly imperfect. All of us are wounded healers.
Yeah, I love that, and my journalist in me is going back to my previous question, so I'm going to go back there for a little bit. So we talked about their social activism and their possible weak spots and how they don't necessarily embrace people of other faith traditions or people of faith traditions at all. So what are some of the deficits, I'll call it, people that are too spiritually oriented, let's put it, or at least spiritually oriented to the exclusion of seeing other things?
Yeah. So I think often what I hear from people when I'm doing my training in spiritual activism is that activism feels dirty. For lack of a better word, it feels like it messes with their spiritual center, with their sense of inner peace, with their capacity to navigate the world. It feels like it's us versus them.
Yeah.
And they don't have the tools or skills to navigate that, to find the spiritual center to engage in activism. So I think that's a risk if we engage. Also, I think sometimes, there's the saying, heal yourself and you'll heal the world. And as
if they were two specifically different things, right?
Well, as if you could,
Right.
if you actually could. If you're living in a world that is deeply broken, you will continue to have broken people in that world. So they have to happen simultaneously. It's interesting when I think about the Torah again. Moses was raised in Pharaoh's castle, right? He was raised in Pharaoh's home. But he was, his first few years or whatever, he was raised by his mom. So that's how come he knows Hebrew and recognizes the brethren that are being abused and killed and slaughtered and the enslaved. And then he engages and he kills a taskmaster. And then he finds out that everyone knows that he's done that. So now he realizes his life is at risk. So he flees. And we like to say he flees to Midian. He flees to his meditative retreat for a few decades. And he shepherds sheep and he has a wife and he has a kid and he leads his life and it's peaceful and he's cool until the burning bush, until the burning power within him remembers there are people suffering. My brethren are suffering. And then he's awakened. So, and Moses says to God, I can't do this. I stutter. And God says, don't worry. I'll send you Aaron. I'll send you Miriam. Don't worry. I'll be there with you. Here's a rod. It'll turn into a snake. It'll do all these magical things. And even Moses was like happy being in his meditative retreat center, if you will. But at some point that voice called to him and he wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. He screwed up throughout the whole thing. The Torah's one story after another, and he's our greatest rabbi, and he screwed up a zillion times. He didn't get to go into the promised land because he hit the rock instead of used his words. So it's true, being engaged in social justice work is mucky and difficult and painful and challenging. And it doesn't mean it can't be spiritual. Maybe the answer is that maybe the deepest spiritual work is being able to find a way to navigate the challenges and places that make us really uncomfortable with a grounded, loving center.
I want you to tell me a little bit about, I know you and Michael Lerner have done some work with Palestinians and Israelis. Can you speak a little bit about what that work was and which you got out of it, what it demonstrated to you, if anything?
Yeah, I would say Michael's done a lot more work with both communities. He spent some time there trying to build a religious left movement in Israel to counter the religious right movement. And he was very active and has long standing relationships with a lot of Palestinian activists. And I have been doing that work for many, many years as well. And for both of us, I think that it kind of grounded in the same values, which is recognizing that both peoples are suffering from great trauma or PTSD. And so that deeply impacts and informs how they experience their lived reality. And if we don't understand that, then we will not be able to address the problem. At the same time, I'll speak for myself, but I think it's fair to say for Michael too, that Israel is the one with the power. So they have the responsibility to do the repair. And we need to understand that Jews came out of the Holocaust and landed on the backs of Palestinians. And in the process are creating incredible, awful, intolerable, unjust, inhumane situation. And frankly, it's not sustainable for anybody as we're watching it unfold. So when I spent a summer in Israel a couple of years ago and spent some time in the occupied territories, meeting with people and learning about it and just seeing it firsthand. And it's, I can't know, it's just devastatingly heartbreaking. And what we know is happening now is these great risings on the street in Israel by Israelis, but the vast majority of them, like 80%, if not more, are not challenging the occupation, challenging the fact that they're going to lose their democratic rights, rights that have been denied to Palestinians forever. So it's a fallacy. They can get back their rights, and they return back to the perfect time when they had their rights, and Palestinians in the West Bank didn't. And even within Israel, a lot of those rights are not at the same level, even though they have the right to vote. Now, Arabic is not a recognized primary language anymore. So there are efforts now in Israel to birth a left religious movement. I don't know how committed I don't know if that left religious movement, because I'm not a part of it, is committed to ending the occupation. I believe that certainly a large percentage of them probably are, but a lot of Israelis were fine with it. I mean, when I was there, I asked somebody at one of the schools I was at, like, we're studying these texts. We're studying these amazing texts, and we're not talking about the occupation. That's really awful. And the director of the program said, well, we brought you here and we brought you there. And I said, you brought me to places that Israel has occupied and turned into historical monuments for Israel on the gravestones, essentially, of Palestinian territories and lands and peoples. And he, I don't remember what he said. And I said, well, let's imagine for a moment that you were living in Germany in the 30s, in the 20s or 30s, with the rise of Nazism. And you walked into a Christian or Catholic school, and they were studying Jesus's teachings. Jesus, of course, being a Jew, was taught by rabbis. He had all this love the stranger, like that. Those are all Jewish teachings. And no one talked about what's happening to Jews and the discourse that's being used and how would you feel? And he looked at me and said, it's not that bad yet. And I said, have you asked Palestinians if it's that bad yet? How do you know? You're not them. It is that bad. And then I said, and what exactly are you waiting for? Because when it gets that bad, it'll be too late. It'll be your rights. And here we are. Here we are in that moment.
I'm thinking about this. You talked about domination, and I wonder what is it in the human heart that does these things? Yes, we know about the Jews and what they're doing to the Palestinians, and other people can argue with us that it's not that way. But we're not going to talk. We're not going to include them right now. It's just you and me talking here. This story has played out so many different things in history. I think about Liberia, for example, and I think about how African Americans went to Liberia and essentially imposed the same kind of situation that they came from. So what is it? What is it as humans that we do this? That we go to this kind of place where we're other and better than other people? I don't get it.
I think it's trauma. I think
Yeah.
it's the trauma, right? We haven't healed our trauma, and if we don't, then we're going to play out the trauma. So we see this in families with abuse. It's not that everyone carries on the abuse that they experience, but it is that a lot of people do. And some people carry out the abuse on themselves, and some people carry it out on others. But we know that there's this repetition compulsion pattern within us. And unless we look at this through the lens of including trauma into our analysis, that's why I said both peoples have trauma. And so when, for example, Hamas throws a bomb into Israel, even if it doesn't hurt anybody and land anywhere, that makes Israelis panic. They're trying to wipe us off the face of the earth. They don't have the power to do, of course that's not going to happen. But the trauma is there. I mean, if you look at the rise in anti-Semitism in the United States and the fear that brings up for Jews, I can almost guarantee you with the rise of anti-Semitism, every single Jew has thought about, where can I go to be safe? And where do most Jews think about? Israel. So there's this incredible trauma. Slaves who left here and set up, went to Liberia. Imagine the amount of trauma. And I mean, I can't, it's the same, it's a different manifestation of trauma. It's the same trauma. And we have to find a way to heal our trauma and acknowledge it. And that's part of the repair. That's part of what we call in Judaism teshuvah and tikkun. It's teshuvah being repair, which has a whole bunch of steps, which is part of the process of prophetic empathy. And tikkun being healing and repair and transformation. In order to get to justice, we need to have acknowledgement of what's happened to, instead of doing what we're trying to do now in our country. A lot of people are like, we're just not going to talk about our history. It's too difficult to talk about, or even in Jewish circles, sometimes I don't want to talk about Israel. It's too painful. The only way through it is to talk through it. And yes, we might have to take a break. We might have to back out of the conversation because I'm getting too charged and too upset. And so I'm not responding calmly and compassionately. So we have to hold each other with tenderness through the transformation process, through the healing process.
So we have this event coming up, April 16th.
Yes.
People have a lot of options for what they do with their time. Your highest hope for what people might get out of this event?
Great question. I mean, my highest hope is that people will leave with some hope and inspiration, that there's ways to engage in healing and repairing and transforming our world that is also very much in alignment with their hearts and souls for kindness and compassion and love, that they can also bring their fully unhealed selves and their fully striving selves for greater healing for themselves and the world, that no one has to be perfect to participate in healing this world, because there is no one perfect on this planet.
Yeah, I share your hope. So just to remind people, we've got a couple of events. It's on April 16th. I believe it's at 2 p.m. to 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. And also Cat is also going to be leading a subsequent event, which I'll tell you about in the show notes. And Cat, it's delightful to speak with you. I feel inspired, and I hope other people that listen to this also feel inspired. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I look forward to the 16th and beyond.
Yeah, it's great.